Thank you for coming. That I definitely want to repeat. I had no idea how many people would want to attend this little pre-conference session. I call it an orientation session, but there are people in this audience, there are a couple of people in this audience who know almost as much about this field as I do. So I'm not quite sure why you bothered to come. But for the rest of you, yeah. I mean, of course, the main conference starts tomorrow, as you know, but we have, because it's rather, because so many people wanted to speak, we have put on this additional session of short talks, which I believe is going to start at 4 o'clock. I'm not exactly sure how many short talks we ended up having, but I think it's 8. So each speaker at that point will have 15 minutes because we want to end by 6 o'clock, which is when the post-session and the serious drinking begins. And so yes, so this is welcome to Longevity Summit Dublin. This is, in a very real sense, a recreation, a restart of possibly my single favourite part of everything I've done over the past 20 years, namely the conference series that I've done. I started running conferences in 2003 in Cambridge, and we had 6 of those, and they were, when I was a youngster, I used to give serious parties. I mean, actual parties as you normally recognize the term. And this was really my party again, right, when I started doing those. And then, of course, as some of you know, we did a couple of those conferences in Berlin. But since COVID, we've had none of that, and I have missed it like hell. So thank you so much for being here and coming to my party. But yes, as I say today, before we get to the short talks at 4 o'clock, I thought it would be worthwhile, because I knew that a lot of people are going to be here who are very new to the field, to just make myself available to to maximize the amount that you guys will get from the rest of the conference, simply by giving you some orientation, really. And so what I want to do, since we've got nearly 2 hours, I want it to be very free form. I want this to be extremely interactive, so get used to it. You are not just going to sit there like dummies and listen. You're going to actually ask me questions and, get involved. So I'm going to start, and you can tell why. I haven't even put this on full screen, right? Because I'm going to be jumping around. I'm going to be basically responding to you in what I say until we're done. So I'm just going to say a few very basic things at the beginning. This is my standard statement of the problem. What's gone on? What is wrong with medicine that it has been so ridiculously unsuccessful in doing anything about the health problems of late life, right? I mean, since we've come so far with, bearing down on the diseases that used to kill so many people not very long ago, only a couple of 100 years ago. I mean, I don't know if any of you know the numbers, but let me just remind you that in the 1800s or back before then, there were literally more than 1/3 of babies would die before the age of 1. That's the definition of infant mortality. And that was in the wealthiest countries, the UK, Ireland, whatever. It was it's insane. And we solved this problem really ridiculously easily. So, what's the difference? And let me see. Yeah. The fundamental answer to that question has to begin by defining the word aging, which is ridiculous, right? I mean, aging has been the #1 problem for humanity since the dawn of civilization. We're not very happy about it, but we still can't agree on a definition of the word. I mean, Jesus Christ. So I've gravitated to this definition, which I've been using for many years now. And the purpose of this definition is to, well, first of all, to be accurate, of course, to actually say what aging is in a manner that corresponds with reality, but also to be to demystify aging, because a hell of a large part of the problem with talking to people about aging, getting people interested in the possibility of doing something about it, is that they feel that it's some kind of universal thing that's woven into the fabric of the universe, and they kind of haven't realized that they don't understand it. It's that bad. So yeah, I like to say it this way. Aging in human beings or living organisms in general is really no different than aging of a car or an airplane or any other simple non-living man-made machine. Basically every machine, at least every machine that has moving parts, does itself damage, starting even before we're born. And that damage, it accumulates over time, just as a consequence of the machine's normal operation, and eventually there's more damage than what the body is set up to tolerate, and that's where things start to go downhill. That's what, of course, the word pathology means. That's all that aging is. And we have various ways to do things about it. I'm going to skip a few slides here. And essentially, the main thing that I'm known for is that about 22 years ago, I realized that the field had been overlooking a paradigm, a way to go about doing something about aging, which is the middle one, the maintenance one. So I'm going to talk a lot about that during the next hour and a half or whatever. But before I do that, I want to ask you guys the first question I'm going to ask you. I'm going to say, in terms of the definition of aging, which I've already dealt with, is that a surprise to any of you? Hands up anyone who, in their heads, they had a different definition of aging. Whoa.
It seems to me that there's incredible ambiguity about the term aging, because a 1,000-year-old car that's never been run is still 1,000 years old.
So Walter...
We're talking about biological aging or...
So Walter, I'll repeat the question. So Walter just said that the... well, if I may paraphrase, that it's not obvious that aging of a human body or aging of a car are really the same thing, at least not in a practically useful sense. That, we've got cars that are 100 years old, but they're still 100 years old in some sense. But this is kind of the point. Cars have one big difference from human beings, namely that the initial design has improved, right? Cars that were built recently are inherently much higher performing than cars that were built 100 years ago, whereas the design of the human being has not improved in that time, or indeed in the previous 100,000 years, right? But that's kind of not really the point. The point is what happens after the thing is built. And what we do have with cars is cars that are 100 years old. They are not working as well as cars that were built last year, but they sure as hell are working as well as they were working when they were built. And that's really all that matters here. We're talking about, can we keep an organism as functional as it used to be? This is kind of the difference between therapy and enhancement, if you like. That, I'm working on therapy. I'm interested in making sure, in trying to get people who were born a long time ago to work as well as those people were working when they were young adults. Some people may be interested in enhancement, in making people's bodies do things that they can't currently do, like giving them gills or wings or whatever. But that's not what I do. So I believe that it is a valid definition if you look at the right aspect of it, a valid analogy, shall we say. Any other reservations? Hello, go, Zach.
Aging has a different, like we call it like a mosaic of aging. So there's certain parts of you that age at different rates. So depending on where you are,
yep.
Whether it be the cells for, say, nerves will age slower than they would say breast cells or something.
Yeah, but that's like. Are you saying that translates into a problem with the definition of aging?
Yeah, I think because we think of aging to be, was it visual, is it the functionality? You've got to define what that element of aging is.
Okay, so that's got an interesting point here. I used to run a journal called Rejuvenation Research. And that's, as you will shortly see, a good name because it's all about rejuvenation, meaning taking someone back to a earlier biological age. But I had to fight like hell for that name for the journal, repeatedly. And the reason I did was because the word had been co-opted to basically mean cosmetics, right? And it took years before that changed, but it has now changed. You know, respectable conferences working on actual biological aging use the word rejuvenation in their name, you know, companies do and so on, right? So that was a battle that I took a long time to win. It's kind of the same thing what you're saying, Zach, I think, that, you know, we need to care what aspects of aging we actually care about. We need to work out what we care about. And of course we do care about aging insight, you know, function. Sometimes biological age is defined badly as, you know, in terms of markers, you know, proxy measures. But I think that the right way to measure biological age is in terms of function, activities of daily living, things like that, right? And it turns out that if you do that, then there are, you know, there are interventions against aging, which by other measures seem to be quite effective, but by that measure they're not. It's also very useful looking at it that way to get away from a very critical question, which I'm sure we'll come back to, namely the question of the relationship between aging and age-related diseases, right? So,
Aubrey, just Sophie wants to say something here as well.
go ahead.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say I totally agree with you because there's a society perception that actually it's a vanity thing because one of our executives said, I hope we're not going to be investing in Botox, and it's like, well actually that's a vanity, that's cosmetic. Whereas my mum, she is into this, she was born 67 and she gets that injection in her, and she said she recently started taking it again, but she has difficulty because she has to get it over from America,
Got it.
ban in UK, and she gets the fact that she has to have something in her to repair that damage, but the people that don't have a clue, they think, oh, you're getting Botox.
Yes, quite. Yeah, I mean, so actually let's talk about this distinction between aging and disease a little bit right now, because it's a really big issue. You know, there's an enormous amount of heat and no light in this conversation typically, because people have convictions, like some people will say, aging is not a disease. And what they mean is not really clear, but what people hear is aging is off limits to medicine, right? That you can't really do anything about it. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I don't. Are we on?
I think it's on.
Okay, so, I don't think this is hair splitting, but we're looking at metabolism, damage, and pathology. I think that the damage happens all the time. Our skin replaces itself every whatever, our stomach linings, but it's the damage to the repair mechanisms, or the damage to the repair mechanisms that repair the repair mechanisms. You get to the bottom of the heap sometime.
So
that feels like more like aging, because then nothing keeps up with the repair of the repair of the repair of the repair.
Yeah. So sorry, what's your name?
Richard Swift.
Oh, of course. So you are, yes. Right, so Richard makes a very good point here. So let me elaborate on what he just said. The question really is, if we talk about metabolism, in other words, the network of processes that keep us alive, progressively creating damage, the question then is, why does that happen? Why does damage accumulate over time and eventually, therefore, get to the point that exceeds what the body is set up to tolerate? And we have the pathologies. And a lot of people say pretty much exactly what you just said, Richard, that the issue is that the mechanisms that keep damage under control when we're young become less effective. And that is certainly true, it does happen. And it contributes very definitely to the rate at which damage accumulates. But what that analysis does not incorporate is the issue of why the repair mechanisms go downhill. we have to have some explanation for that. We can't just say, there's this magic clock in the body that, suddenly blows a whistle at age 50 or whatever. And the real answer to that question is that there are some types of damage which we do not have the ability to repair even in youth, right? Even when we're young, even before we're born. And those type of damage accumulate throughout life, really truly lifelong, right? And that's the clock. In other words, eventually those types of damage get to a point where they start to interfere with the types of repair that were working well earlier on. So this is still correct. It's just that it's a condensation of what you just said.
It's like turtles all the way down.
Well, not all the way down is the point. There is a type of damage which is never repaired, right? And it's the types of damage that are repaired well early on that become less well repaired later on. So no, it's not all the way down. It's you can think of primary and secondary damage, and that's it. Right? Go, David.
On the subject of turtles,
Yep.
aren't there some animals that are negligibly senescent, which means that they must have repair mechanisms that are likely even in the types of damage that you mentioned?
So let me elaborate on what David just said. So David was talking about organisms that appear not to age at all. So he used the technical term negligibly senescent, which basically actually tells you something. He didn't say non-senescent. And so I'll start there. The reason why in biology we use the term negligible senescence rather than non-senescence is because we establish the issue of whether an organism, whether a species ages by looking at a certain population, right? And typically we will measure, our measure for whether the species ages or not is by lifespan. So by the average age at which the organisms die. And typically this is done in the wild, in wild populations. So you've got a finite, often rather small in fact, number of individuals that you're looking at, and you'll ask questions like, what proportion of, and if you've got some way to measure how old they are, which you often do, like for example, fish have a particular bone, most fish anyway, have a particular bone in their ear called the otolith, which oscillates on an annual basis in terms of its density. So it's very like tree rings. So there are some species at least where you can actually accurately say how old they are. And you can ask, therefore, whether the proportion of the animals that are a particular age declines on a straightforward exponential curve like radioactive decay, right? If that's what happens, then that means there's no aging by that metric, the metric of lifespan. But the point is, you can only measure that to a certain level of accuracy. So so the definition of negligible senescence is that the distribution of ages that you see of that nature, of that type in the wild, is statistically insignificantly different from an exponential decay curve. Whereas a species that does age, you will see an acceleration in mortality rate. In other words, you will see a kind of more rectangular curve than an exponential decay. All right, so the reason I mention all that is because it means that a lot of species out there that satisfy the definition of negligible senescence probably do actually age. It's just that we haven't looked at enough of them. And my personal view is that pretty much absolutely all vertebrates are in that category. So even if you go down to fish or whatever, there are certainly plenty of lower vertebrates whose rate of aging is evidently slow enough that for the amount of data that we currently have, we can't say that they age. But we can make indirect arguments. We can say, well, they're made of the same stuff that we are. Their body plans are more or less the same. They've got hearts and livers and brains and stuff. Therefore, chances are they do age, right? I'm reminded of a great sketch by Norm Macdonald. He was saying, like, I feel I'm going to die. You know, I mean, I'd like to feel I'm not going to die, but you know, my dad died, and my grandfather died, and his dad, and his dad. I think he died, because if not, he'd have been on Extra, or some comedy show. So we can't. This is the kind of, it kind of gets to the same point. We can't know for sure, and so then we have to ask, well. We have two questions. The first question is, what about organisms that are really primitive? Can we ask the question more definitively? And the answer is yes, you can. Especially, if you go down as far as single-celled organisms, then I don't like to do that because defining what's an organism becomes different, right? You can't really say that such an organism ages by the same definition that you might use for a multicellular organism. But there are multicellular organisms that are nice and simple, like Hydra, that pretty much we can definitively say they don't age. And so is that useful? Well, kind of no, because they don't have brains. Don't know about you, but I'm quite fond of my central nervous system, and I wouldn't want to sacrifice it in order to live forever. So I'm not really in favour of looking at really primitive organisms. We can generally, say they're not relevant. And it's worse than that, because the other question that one might ask about very long-lived organisms that appear not to age is, well, okay, maybe they do age, but really slowly, more slowly than we do, or at least they're better at not aging in some way or other, by some definition or other. And therefore, maybe we can learn things from those organisms that we can translate into actual therapies that would help us to age more slowly. And in fact, that's where the whole field of gerontology came from about a century or more ago. People looked at the living world and they said, well, you know what? There's a lot of variation there. Maybe we can understand it and so on. But still, it's not worked out too well. We have not really extracted anything from nature in terms of understanding that is actually of biomedical relevance at this point. This is fun. You're being a lot more interactive than I was expecting. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I'm not comfortable with this idea of pathology.
Speak up a little bit, I can't hear you. And in fact, you've got a microphone.
Okay. I would prefer to focus on damage and pathology, first because the definition of what's pathologic or not vary with time. Just to illustrate, ADHD was not a pathology, it's now. Okay. Pre-diabetes is not, and also pathology, it's multifactorial. When you say age-related disease, we take type 2 diabetes, for example. Age is one of the factors that lead to cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes. But the study of the damage repair mechanism is much more interesting and much more promising than looking at pathology. We have been only forced to look at pathology for regulatory reason because the agencies are not considering work on damage as science or something that can be regulated. So therefore, no entry barrier, and it cannot be regulated and cannot be profitable.
Yeah, so you're making a good point. The word pathology is a movable feast, yes, and it's not necessarily. Well, I agree that it's not necessarily the interesting thing. But the purpose of this kind of, condensation of the whole issue into 3 words is to explain why pathology isn't interesting, really. If we look at the top 3 words, right, which are methods of intervention, then we I think we have an answer to what you just said. So the idea, let me just stand back for a moment and explain the picture a little bit. The reason why it's useful to have this 3-word definition of aging at the bottom, metabolism causing damage and then the damage causing pathology, is that it tells us what our goal is. That the goal is to separate metabolism from pathology, to allow people to carry on performing metabolism, as in being alive, without getting sick, right? And so the 3 things at the top are the ways to potentially separate metabolism from pathology. You could separate them by separating damage from pathology, which is what geriatric medicine, I'm using the term loosely, of course, but what it basically is, or you could do the thing I was talking about a moment ago, trying to extrapolate from the living world, from organisms that live a long time. And that's really what the gerontology approach is, to try to separate metabolism from damage. And then there's the maintenance approach, which is, of course, my focus, and we'll get onto that soon, which is to repair the damage after it's been created, but before it gets to be abundant enough to be bad for you. So then what this does do, this synopsis of the whole thing, is it explains why geriatric medicine is a waste of time. It's basically saying, if we attack pathologies, then we've got two huge problems. First of all, we've got the problem that there are so many different pathologies that hit people, more or less at the same age, same time. They interact with each other, they exacerbate each other, you know, and as you say, even the definition of pathology is a bit shifting. But the second problem is more fundamental. The second problem is that the pathologies are a consequence of something that's accumulating, namely damage, right? And as such, any geriatric medicine is definitely, any geriatric medicine is going to become progressively less effective as the person gets older and accumulates more damage. It's going to be, you know, damage is going to put more pressure on to make things go badly. So this, I guess, comes back in some ways to, in a lot of ways actually, to what I was saying earlier about the danger of trying to distinguish aging from disease. And I didn't actually finish that point, so let me say a little more about that. People are doing quite well right now in essentially expanding the definition of the word disease so that it includes aging. Essentially what they're doing there is they're saying, you know, aging is bad for you, we should call it a disease. And that's okay up to a point, but calling aging a disease in some ways is almost as bad as saying aging is not a disease. Because saying aging is not a disease implies that, as I said earlier, you know, it's off limits to medicine. Saying it is a disease kind of implies that you can cure it in the same way that you can cure an infection, you know. And that's equally wrong and equally dangerous. So, you know, come the revolution, when I rule the world, it will be illegal to use the word aging and the word disease in the same sentence, because, you know, whatever you say, however you try to relate them, you're always wrong. So I like to say aging is a medical problem. It kind of sidesteps the issue, right? But in terms of measuring it, I think that I'm using the word pathology here very much in the way I said earlier, as loss of function, loss of ability to do this or that, whether it's physiological, whether it's cognitive, irrespective of whether the loss of function can be localized to a particular organ or whatever. Go ahead, please.
I'm not sure to understand why you're reluctant to use aging as a disease. There's plenty of diseases we don't cure. You said there's no cure, but HIV, for example, there's no cure, but we manage, and we save a lot of life. I can take multiple other examples of disease that we don't cure.
So that's really good. That's really good. So yeah, mostly when we talk about diseases that we don't cure, it's because we can't, right? Whereas HIV is a brilliant example of a disease that we manage, despite not being able to eliminate it from the body. Very good point. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that most of the cases where we feel we can't cure something is because we can't do it yet, but we're still trying to, right? So, you know, cancer. Let's just take cancer. The reason why there's so much more money going into cancer research than there is into aging research is fundamentally because people, including people who write big checks from the government, feel that it's plausible that sometime soon we will be able to cure cancer, which is a big shame, because actually cancers and almost all cancers are age-related, right? And so that, you know, at the end of the day, the reason why they're age-related is because they are driven by the accumulation of mutations, which is a type of damage, a side effect of metabolism, right? Which is going to carry on happening. I must say, when I first heard, I mean, so I wasn't around in 1970 or whatever when the war on cancer began, but when I first heard about the kind of logic that oncologists, proper oncologists, were using back then, which caused the war on cancer to happen, I was absolutely astonished. You know, the idea that cancer could be transformed into a chronic disease. I mean, it's kind of completely antithetical to the whole concept of cancer, that, you know, where natural selection is going on within the tumor, right? The idea, I mean, like, I just have no idea how anyone who understood cancer at all could possibly think that, let alone say it. So, loads of questions. This is getting fun now. Barry.
Aubrey, where do extrinsic causes of damage fit into your model of aging?
The question is, where do extrinsic causes of damage fit into this model? They don't, really, but I kind of think that's okay, because, I mean, extrinsic causes of damage, the question is first of all, the first question is the damage persistent? So, an infection causes damage, but the theory, at least, is that but most infections, once the immune system has eliminated them, there's nothing left. There's no footprint. Extrinsic causes, like, for example, accumulation of heavy metals, right? This is a pretty good one. And I don't really include that in my definition of aging, but I definitely acknowledge that it matters. So I would accept that that's an imperfection of this, that perhaps extrinsic causes of damage that do persist and do accumulate over time should be included. Yeah, honestly, I admit guilt. Right, go.
There's another form where you have an accident, you dislocate your knee or something, some kind of injury which prevents you from exercising. It causes a vicious circle that you can't exercise. You can't repair yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, certainly if you're elderly, I mean, the classic example is falls, right? That, you know, break a bone, you know, it messes you up. You know, it definitely shortens your remaining lifespan, right? But there I feel a little bit more comfortable excluding it than I do in the case of what Barry just said, simply because there isn't much of an effect of that nature when you're young. It's really something that becomes, that vicious circle really kicks in when your internal, natural repair systems are already impaired. Yeah.
I understood that the definition of disease used by regulators is something that only no more than 50% of people get. Hence, menopause isn't a disease, because everyone gets it.
Well, not, I mean, you and I, etc. Keep going.
Everyone who qualifies gets it, right? But if everyone gets something, then by definition, to the regulators, it's not a disease. Is that correct?
This is a very interesting point, and the answer is no, luckily. So the question, in case, did you have a microphone? I will repeat the question otherwise. I know. I mean, I'll repeat it. I'll repeat it. Don't worry. I just wanted to make sure for the recording. That's all. Yeah. So the issue here is what's the definition of a disease from the point of view of regulators, people who are, unfortunately, extremely important in the ecosystem of medicine in terms of defining and influencing incentive structures. And the question is, can something be a disease if most or all people get it? And of course, everyone's got aging. Luckily, no. At least as of now, it wasn't really the same until quite recently, but no, there has been a seismic shift, I would say, in the official classification, so to speak, of aging in relation to that. There's something that's maintained by the World Health Organization called the International Classification of Disease that is now, in its latest form, including aging in two different ways. It's a bit complicated, and in order to not spend too long on it, and also in order not to steal his thunder, I will refer you to this man here, stand up for a second, who is going to be presenting a poster tonight on exactly this topic, because he, along with a couple of colleagues, was instrumental in the process of making this happen. All right, there was plenty more. Who hasn't asked a question yet? Someone at the back there, yes.
You spoke about the danger between not connecting disease and aging before. And I was wondering, I'm pretty new to the conferences of aging right now, but I'm wondering why the whole subject of psychological aging is being let aside. Because like this morning we experienced that we're late on a taxi, that we have like a pimple on our face, or something like small things that affect our immune system on a very deep molecular level every millisecond, I would say. So how don't we treat psychological aging just exactly as we treat biological or chronological aging? Make an inventory of, I don't know, psychomics or like something like that, and just see how they react, like deregulated sensing and so on.
What an excellent question, thank you. So psychological aging, how does psychological aging fit into all of this? Now, first of all, I totally admit guilt in terms of this model, and also more than that, in terms of the way that I talk about maintenance, which is this kind of classification of different types of damage and how we might go about them. I focus there on physical aging, but you're completely right that psychological aging is extraordinarily important. The question is really, should it be considered a separate category, or should it be considered as part of biological aging? You know, the way I think about psychological aging is it is driven in many ways, but some of them are straightforwardly biological, like, you know, dementia and so on. These things, whether they come under the classic definition of Alzheimer's, for example, or not, still, at the end of the day, there's a physical basis for a lot of the decline in cognitive function that happens. Then there is, of course, the issue of the impact of aging on one's level of stress, one's level of satisfaction with life, etc., right? And there, I feel that the right way to think about it, the most effective way to think about these problems, is that they are consequences of the biological aging. In other words, that a huge amount of it comes from one's dissatisfaction, frustration with having less energy, having less mental acuity, things like that. So, I mean, am I really answering your question? I'm not entirely sure whether I've covered the things that you're thinking about.
Aubrey, we do have that. Somebody wants to weigh in.
We can. That's a great question. That's what we work on. Exactly, the psychological aging. We look at the effects on menopause and stuff like that, not just biologically, but also the emotional impact that it has on you and how you categorize that. And that would be a great way to look at it. But to quantify it, hey, that's really difficult. And hopefully everyone else in this room can help quantify it. We've got a couple of lines we've done, but the rest, you know, and you very much the emotional aspect, like the cortisol levels are affected by stress and make you infertile, stuff like that. So absolutely.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jack. Right, yeah.
Thank you. So on the subject of psychological aging, I'd like to bring Elon Musk into this conversation because he made this eminently frustrating statement about death being necessary for progress, and his argument is essentially older people get set in their ways and you need younger people with new ideas. But wouldn't you agree that if we were to reverse biological aging, we would reverse the decline in neuroplasticity that currently occurs with age, and therefore older people would be just as creative and capable of generating and adopting new ideas as younger people are today?
So I would agree with that in theory. However, I have to acknowledge that we have to do the experiment. We don't really know whether that's going to be true, whether rejuvenated people are going to be as creative as otherwise. However, one thing that I feel is quite important to recognize in this context is that simply encouraging changes of habit, changes of focus, is an extremely effective way for people to be rejuvenated cognitively anyway. The example that often comes up with me, simply because I'm an example of it, is switching fields. For those of you who don't know, I was originally a computer scientist, did artificial intelligence research for many years, and I became a biologist only in my early 30s. And I am by no means the only example of somebody who has switched fields like that and made significant contributions in their new field. The most famous example is that the whole of molecular biology was invented in the 1950s by a bunch of physicists. So I think there are plenty of other ways that we can do this. No, I mean, I think slightly flippantly, I did respond to Elon's comment of that nature. I said, well, okay, look, if it's true, let's suppose it's true that the elderly get in the way in terms of societal cognitive ossification, then, yes, we could just let them get sick and die and have a lot of suffering, but we could equally, the problem is that they get in the way of the young. There are other ways to stop them from getting in the way of the young, and one of them would be to put them somewhere else, like, I don't know, Mars, for example. Right?
The young or the
Well, that's exactly the point, right? So, of course, I was thinking let's put the elderly on Mars because, of course, Elon Musk has said that he wants to die on Mars and not on impact. There's humour here too. Go.
I was going to suggest just a possible reason for pessimism on that. Getting stuck in your ways as you're older could be because neuroplasticity is decreased, but it also could just be a rational strategy for explore-exploit trade-offs. You experiment until you find something that works, and then once you found something that works, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Mm-hmm. So that's a possible reason for pessimism, but I would prefer that we do the experiment and find out. And even if we're stuck in our ways, dying is an extreme solution to that problem.
And getting sick first is also an extreme solution. Now, Felix, I would like you to go and get me another pint of Smithwick's, please. And you can give someone else that camera while you're doing it. Thank you. Right, any more questions before I move on?
One thing just about the kind of the spiritual or psychic field that Penrose talks about in his son Mervyn, the books that are written about that. How does your dog know when you're coming home? Sorry. Rupert Sheldrake, sorry. Rupert Sheldrake, and the notion of how does your dog know that you're coming home, etc. And he talks about like the psychic field, and that we're all connected, as one, and the consciousness and super consciousness. Just where does that fit in to this whole scenario?
I haven't a fucking clue.
Just to add on to that, obviously the superconsciousness, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a lot of people that achieve self-actualization, superconsciousness through meditation, they actually are quite happy and cheery and just like laugh at life. Perhaps that's something that could be studied from that psychological aspect. Actually, happiness sometimes does lead to slowing down.
So this is an issue. So I want to actually do a tangent on that. A huge part of the problem that I've had over the past 20 years as I've been fighting against aging is that the people I'm trying to help don't complain enough. There is too much fatalism. I mean, fatalism that gets to the extreme point of being more like complacency, right? So yes, maybe it's stressful to focus on aging, to have aging in your mind. But I'd prefer to, at least at my age, or when I started this, to try my best, to put the time in to try to think ahead, so to speak, and stop myself from getting sick when I get old, even if that involves, more stress in the near term. Now, of course, it depends what kind of person you are. I'm a natural, belligerent fighter kind of person, and I don't find it in any way stressful to do that. Whereas a lot of people, they just conflict averse or whatever, it's a different matter. Misha? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Well, I just wanted
Go
to
ahead.
say that one problem here, everybody on the street, and I imagine everybody in this room will agree that a 3-year-old is aging, even as they improve every day, even all the way back to gastrulation and maybe all the way back to conception. So the term is inherently confusing to the common person. Furthermore, what we see is that as a young person ages, they are improving at a slower and slower rate. Is that slower rate damage related, or is it something else?
Yeah, and of course it's very, very hard to unpick that because so much of it is societal, it's circumstance. Misha?
So just on that point that was just raised, Denham Harman, the father of the ROS hypothesis, he published a very poorly cited paper in the 70s that stated that by the time we are born, 20% of damage has happened. So you can track it down. So I think that relates to what you said. But this is the concept of psychological aging is kind of new to me. So I just wanted to bring an example from my personal life and perhaps suggest one of the ways to tackle the issue. So if you ask a teenager or a university student, they're absolutely convinced, even if they are not in medical sciences, that they're not going to die. If you ask a typical 85 or 90-year-old, they're absolutely convinced that they are going to die, and they are fine with that psychologically. So obviously there is a cut-off somewhere, and if we remove people from the pool like Aubrey, inveterate optimists and belligerent bellicose fighters, and just focus on the statistically average population, I think it will be very interesting to figure out when that change happens, and if it's a function of accumulated damage or just simply time or something like that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that I think that the number one contributor to that change of attitude to aging that goes on over time is actually not neither of the things you just said. I think it's mostly managing one's own expectations. In other words, there's no point in worrying about something that you can't do anything about, and there's also no point in worrying about something that you think you don't need to do anything about, but there's plenty of point if you feel that you're in the middle between the two and you feel that you could actually do something about it if you tried. Now, my personal motivation for working in this field is predominantly humanitarian, actually. It's rather than thinking about myself. And the reason for that is really, I'll say it's mathematical. That I am well aware that the impact of my own work on my own chances of not getting sick when I get old is slight. Even if my contribution were to bring forward the defeat of aging by 10 years, that makes a maximum of like 5 or 10% difference to my chances. Whereas if I think in terms of if I think in terms of the humanitarian benefit, then what that comes down to is that for every day that I bring forward the defeat of aging by my work, I'm saving 110,000 lives. And it's quite easy to get out of bed for that. So that's where my motivation comes from. And I must say that I have always been very surprised that so few other people put it that way. People in the field. Didier, you had a question.
Yeah, so to speak about psychological aspects, for me there is the most important one is called terror management theory, or also called mortality salience. So in 2 or 3 sentences, first, we know that we are going to die of old age if we are not dying from something else. We know that the probability until now is 100%. And sadly, it's not going to change soon if we take a look at the evolution of the last 2 years. But okay. Then the second aspect is this is something that we would not wish, probably even not for you, for your worst enemy, for our worst enemy. And then, in order to make this possible for us to support, we have to make that of old age something positive. And this is an unconscious process. This is very important to know. It's something that once you understand it, it's gone for a big part. So this is an unconscious process that we all have, I would say, well, probably all have. So to say that life is a cycle, death of old age is good for the society, and so on and so on. But now the question is how to change a society without also making it, let's say, psychologically difficult or even worse for most people. I don't have the solution, but I'm listening to your solution.
Right. No, well, I don't have a solution either, that's for sure. But certainly that is a great statement of the problem. Terror management theory was a whole field of psychology that was invented a long time ago now, specifically around terrorism. In other words, essentially helping people to be more rational about how they would cope with a terrorist situation. But it applies very, very strongly to this field. People's acceptance of aging, which I have often called the pro-aging trance, is just spectacularly irrational. And it essentially comes from, I believe, mostly the fact that people are so terrified of aging that their only way to cope is to trick themselves into thinking that they're not terrified at all. And it's some kind of blessing in disguise. Yeah. Okay, go ahead, please.
You said that your personal motivation was to not get, in this field to work on it, was to help people not get sick when they get old.
Right.
Isn't that different than aging? In other words, isn't this semantic argument that we're having getting in the way of what could be an acceptance of aging, meaning I'm going to help you not get sick when you get old as the objective?
Yeah, so I mean, I said earlier that come the revolution, one won't be able to use aging and disease in the same sentence. But really, I would go further. I would say exactly what you just said, that the word aging itself has so much baggage to it that, different interpretations in different contexts and so on, that we should just avoid that word entirely. So when I talk about not getting sick when you get old, it's only like 8 words or 5 words or whatever it is, right? It's completely clearly the definition of the problem and the solution, right? How hard is that, right? So I completely agree with you. I think that just like we need to avoid using words that have too much baggage. Right, a couple more. This is great. Okay, yeah. Okay, let's 2 people who haven't asked a question yet. So yeah, I'll come to you in a second. Yeah, you first. Take the microphone.
Thank you.
Hi. Does it work? Yeah.
Yep.
So on the topic of psychological aging too, like if we manage to reverse biological aging, what's the role of something like maturity or wisdom? Like if there is a psychological developmental process of like accumulating experiences, maybe changing behavior because of things that happen in life, is it something that we should look to reverse too, or is it something that we should embrace and keep? Like, what are we looking for? A 100-year-old mind and a 20-year-old body, or?
Yeah, I get the idea. I get the question. So yeah, I mean, I'm not planning to wipe people's memories, if that's what. But no, I mean, absolutely. I think most people's vision of the goal is indeed a 100-year-old mind in a 20-year-old body, but a 100-year-old mind in the good ways. One that's not one that still has neuroplasticity, as we were saying earlier, but also has all of the accumulated wisdom. Yeah, really, yeah. Wait for the microphone. It's coming over.
Just a short comment and then a question. So I just want to add a layer to the idea of psychological aging as something like social aging, where there's so much that has to do with the way we think about aging, that has to do with our society and what we can and can't do in different stages of life. When can you go to school? When can you change your career? When you can get married, have kids? So I would call it psychosocial
aging.
Very
and
true.
It's very hard to separate that from psychological aging, but I agree with you. We've designed our social aging identities around what our body can and can't do at certain times. So it starts with the physical. But the question I have to you is, what would you say to people who say you should age gracefully?
Okay, so first of all, in response to your comment, I completely agree. One of the ways in which I have said that over the years is that, you know, the goal is to have you be able to keep up with your granddaughter on the dance floor, and that once you can, you might actually start to listen to the music she likes to listen to, right? So exactly what you said. Aging. Okay, so the term aging gracefully is obviously, you know, it's an oxymoron. There's no such thing, right? And the fact that the term is so popular is an absolute example of this terror management thing, right? That you know, it's a way of putting aging out of your mind and thinking that, you know, doing better than the average person of your own chronological age is good enough. You know, it's fucked up, and it mustn't happen.
Actually, I really respond that age gracefully is a criticism of cosmetic stuff that doesn't affect it at all.
Well, no, I mean,
like if someone's not fixing their, you know, biology so that they can live longer and be healthier, but they're getting Botox, then people judge them because, I mean, we shouldn't judge people anyway.
Trying to address the social aging, you know, it's all part of the same thing. If you're addressing cosmetic aging, which maybe
people feel like it's out of the same thing.
Yeah, people maybe in this room might look down upon. It's, to me, I think it's part of the same thing.
Oh, and I don't look down upon it at all. I
said
think
some people.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I think it's wrong to look down on it, because if you look good and you feel that you look good, then that helps your self-image, which reduces your stress, et cetera, right? So there's a very strong linkage there. But yeah, in terms of the term aging gracefully, I think it's used more broadly than what you're implying, that it does incorporate what you can do. You know, yeah. Anyway, where are we? Oh yes, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, just as a personal example on the aging gracefully, you know, I'm now at an age where society says to me, I'm not really supposed to wear a bikini because I'm of that age. So how dare I? And, you know, that aging gracefully, it's behaving yourself as someone perceives you should at that age. Now, personally, in my head, I'm still probably about 25. My father died at 79 from something he could have stopped, but he didn't want to age any further. But he, at that age, was telling me he still felt 16. And if you'd given him a bottle of rum, he was on the dance floor with the rest of us.
He just won't keep up.
He couldn't keep up anymore, but he still gave it a go. But that aging gracefully is again a societal thing that's put on both men and women, not just women.
Totally right, totally right. So I think I'd like to move on to a bit more of the biology, because of course, you know, most of the talks that you're going to be seeing tomorrow and tonight, for that matter, will be a bit technical. And so I want to make sure I spend time giving a bit of an orientation on that. But okay, someone desperately wants to ask it.
This is actually a segue into biology from psychological aging.
All right.
The effect of hormones and hormone decline, or growth in young men and decline in older people affects your attitude very, very profoundly. So has the work been done to determine whether restoring hormone levels restores repair procedures, resets psychology, and people don't try and cope anymore, but they're back to where they were or not?
I'm not entirely sure that specifically that has been explored, but I wouldn't be surprised if it has. In general, the endocrine system, whether in the brain or in the body generally, is an enormous part of aging. Things definitely change. Sometimes because of decline in hormone secretion, sometimes because of things like insulin resistance, where it's the recipient of the hormone that's having a problem. The way to fix that, of course, is to fix the cells, because hormones are fundamentally, you know, they are molecules that transmit information from one cell to another, right? And and so, you know, making that transmission work better, whether at the source end or the destination end, and actually when I first, so I'm about to move on, as you mentioned, to the biology. When I first started talking about the classification of types of damage, I had 9 things in my list rather than 7 for a couple of years. And one of the ones that went away was endocrine aging. And the reason it went away was absolutely not because I felt that it wasn't important, but rather that I wanted to focus on the source and the destination rather than the journey. Right? All right, so I wrote this paper back in 2002. It wasn't just me, I had a bunch of co-authors, and the reason I did was because it came out of a workshop that I ran just 3 months after I had this crazy eureka moment in the summer of 2000 of realizing that damage repair might be very, very, very much easier than anything that came under what I earlier was calling the gerontology approach, slowing down the creation of damage. And so most of what you're going to be hearing about during the next couple of days will all be, well, some more or less explicitly in this space. It's all about how we restore, how we rejuvenate. Damage repair can be defined as the restoration of the structure and composition of the body, whether one organ or whether the whole body, to something reasonably similar to how it was at an earlier age, such that the function of the body is also restored. And of course, the logic here is simply the body's a machine, right? It's a really, really complicated machine, but it's still a machine, and therefore its function is determined by its structure. As such, we need to describe in reasonably accurate terms what changes happen to the structure of the body during life, and especially during early adulthood. Let's define that, for the sake of argument, as from 20 to 40 or 20 to 50, right? Because, as I mentioned in response to, I think, Richard's question earlier, the reason why our repair systems don't work so well late in life is because of the problems that accumulate because we never had a repair system at all, even early in life. So this is all focused on that, on what I was calling primary damage. And I won't try to go through all the biology right now, but you can see that this is, I'm being very concrete here. Like, loss of cells, that is a concrete thing. Cells dying and not being automatically replaced by the division of other cells. Division-obsessed cells, what that means is cancer, basically. It just means cells getting into a state where they divide when they're not supposed to. Waste products, that's an easy thing to understand. And as you can see, I have 2 categories of waste products. Some of you may have heard of a paper that came out in 2013. It was called The Hallmarks of Aging. And it was by far the most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging in the past decade. And that was very pleasing to me, despite the fact that they didn't cite me. Because if they had cited me, they wouldn't have got it published, because it was basically a written branch restatement of what I had said a decade earlier. So now I never have to justify all of this to experts. The idea of a divide and conquer damage repair approach is completely mainstream now. Took a long time, but we're there. So the question then is there some kind of way to some kind of hierarchy or ranking of quality of different people's statement of this idea? Because there's quite a few other people out there who also restated it. And I still like my one, not just because it's mine, but because the classification that I used is focused on the description of how we will fix it. In other words, for each of the types of damage that I list on the left, there is a corresponding generic damage repair approach, an approach that should basically be the same, with only differences of detail, from one example within the category on the left to another. And that's not really true of the more recent restatements of this concept. So that's really why I prefer this one. If you end up going away and comparing and contrasting. But the really important thing about all of this is the thing I'm saying at the bottom. How do we know that this classification is comprehensive, or at least adequately comprehensive? The fundamental reason is I've been challenging my colleagues for 20 years to find types of damage that damage qualifies. The definition here, in order for something to qualify as damage, it has to be something that accumulates over time and eventually contributes to pathology, right? So I've been challenging my colleagues to add to this list, to identify things that are not present here, and yet where there is compelling evidence that pathology does actually arise as a consequence. And I'm still getting away with it, right? So, that's circumstantial evidence, to be sure, but it's pretty strong circumstantial evidence. And of course, one can also, just be more direct about it. Go, please.
If I remember right, I think Blagas-Cloney suggested that Tor signaling should count as an 8th category. Did he say something like that? And what was your answer to that?
So no, he didn't quite say that. So Mikhail Blagas-Cloney is a great friend of mine, a really strong gerontologist based in upstate New York. He is mostly famous for promoting a description of essentially how we age that is, he sometimes calls the quasi-programmed theory of aging. Other people have called it the hyperfunction theory of aging, which is a much better name. Anyway, so without going into all the details of that, the point is it's a description of the process whereby metabolism creates damage. And the key thing that I'm always focusing on is that must be considered completely distinct from the damage itself. So anything that involves signaling involves, short-lived molecules talking to each other in one way or another. That's part of the process of creation of damage. And certainly there's plenty of evidence that Tor signaling is relevant to the rate at which metabolism creates damage. But it's not anything to do with the nature of what the damage actually is that is created.
Does he think, and do you think, that the way Tor signaling causes damage is through these kinds of damage? He frequently seems to talk about how if his theory is a damage theory, it's a theory of organ damage, not of cellular and molecular damage.
Yeah, I remember him saying that. Honestly, I can't really answer your question because I don't really understand his statement. I don't really know what he means by that. I mean, certainly one can talk about damage at the cellular level, and also we can talk separately about damage at the organ level, and one can certainly say that one or another particular process of creation of damage may have more influence on one of those than the other, but kind of so what? I mean, really, essentially, organs are made of cells and stuff between cells, and that's what this is all about. So I really don't think it's a distinction that has any practical consequence. Go, please.
Not to insult you, but does that qualify the ortislopin? Is that task avoiding? In asthma, for example, we know it's multifactorial, but people don't spend the time in asthma conference to discuss the hallmark of asthma. And it seems since 2012 we have been discussing the hallmarks, and there's new hallmark. When there's obvious mechanism of maintenance therapy that could be addressed, and we should focus our attention on addressing these rather than trying to find an other hallmark of aging.
So actually, far from feeling insulted, I basically agree with you. I think that, like for example, just a month or so ago, a paper came out from a group in Copenhagen describing 5 new hallmarks, right? And, that's fine. And I say, meh. I say basically, the point of the hallmarks concept is the concept, not the hallmarks. Yeah. So I kind of feel that in our case, in relation to aging, the concept is basically to say that we should focus on the damage more than the metabolism. More than that, that messing with metabolism, trying to slow down the creation of aging, is really not going to work. We will do better if we focus on what the damage is.
Sorry to rebound on you. You said we should focus on the damage. Should we also focus more upstream on the way we repair? Let's say, for example, double-strand break on DNA damage, which is major DNA damage. As human being, we focus on the non-homologous recombination 2/3 of the time, rather than going for homologous recombination in 1/3 of the time. There's possibility to shift that. That's something we should pay attention rather than the damage itself. It's the way we repair.
So this is the fundamental thing that I have moved the field away from. I believe that absolutely, to the extent that we can slow down the accumulation of damage, perhaps by promoting more high fidelity repair, which of course HR is much more, right? That's fine. I'm fine with that. But at the end of the day, we want to help people who already have a lot of damage, right? And we have the problem that our actual available, plausible interventions to slow down the creation of damage tend to be very difficult to do safely, to not have side effects, simply because the creation of damage is so deeply, intrinsically intertwined with the things that we need the body to do to keep us alive. So, for example, let's just use your example, right? Why is a significant proportion of DNA, double-strand break repair, done by ATJ, right? There's an evolutionary reason. It comes down to how long evolution wants us to live, and not wants us to live, but expects us to live, right? And we don't need to do it any better than we do, but what having these two systems for double-strand break repair gives us is the best ability to live that long. HR requires finding the homologue, right? Doing the thing, it's slower, and therefore having a plan B is actually good for us, right? If we were to, for example, try to shift that balance by knocking out or knocking down an ATJ, we'd almost certainly get more cancer than we currently do, because there will be too many cases where bad things happen instead, right? Because HR didn't get there in time, before a cell division event or whatever, right? David.
So, you made the interesting point that the definition of the damage type hinges on the maintenance approach.
Yep. Well, my definition, my classification does.
I like that a lot. So if there turned out to be a different maintenance approach, which actually did help people, would that mean there would be an eighth damage type? For example,
yes.
Epigenetic reprogramming as being pursued by Altos Labs. It's not clear yet how well it will work in humans, but would that fit under your dark purple intracellular waste products removed using, well, it's not foreign enzymes, it's some other.
So actually, partial reprogramming would most naturally fit under cell loss, because it makes cells more stem-like, more willing, eager to divide appropriately to repopulate cells that are lost, right? But theoretically, there is no question that what you say is correct, that if we were to, for example, find that the best way to get rid of cancers that express high telomerase was different from the best way to get rid of cancers that express ALT, right? Fundamentally different, then my response in terms of my classification would be to subdivide division-obsessed cells according to this.
I've got a question. So my mum likes to inject herself with, I think it's that hormone thing, and she gets me to get my ex-husband to send it over from America because it's not allowed in the UK. So is there like any support groups? Like, I know Dangerous Things. Have you heard of Dangerous Things?
I just thought you meant you knew dangerous things. Right.
So,
I mean, you look like the kind of... No, keep going.
What? So there's obviously transhumanism, part human, part robot. There's this company and they sell things which actually one of my friends has got he bought and injected into himself. It's not approved. He's part of that whole group where they try it out and they show off what they're doing.
Yep.
So obviously I'm new to this, but my mum and dad aren't. And is there like a support group where they can all get together, discuss these things, and perhaps if they're choosing to do things which actually technically aren't allowed to do, but they're still going ahead and do it, isn't there like actually a benefit here? Because you can say, right, you guys, you shouldn't be doing this, but actually we've got a group of 1,000 people across the globe that are actually injecting themselves with this and they're seeing improvements. Let's use their data to justify some of this.
Yes, so great question. So I hope everybody heard this. The question is, like, for therapies that have not yet become approved, or perhaps are available only in some parts of the world and not others, is there a way to exchange information to get so that people can, as it's becoming increasingly popular, do their own research and determine what they want to do on that basis? And absolutely there is. But in aging, it's just kind of getting going. Really, the best example of this historically is an organization called Patients Like Me, which was started by a guy whose brother had ALS. And he wanted to do something about that. And he wasn't impressed with the rate of research and so on. So he set up an organization in which more or less exactly what you just described happens, that people who are doing different things for themselves to try to slow down the progression of the disease will exchange information. And of course, in fairly short order, it broadened way beyond ALS. There's an initiative right now which I believe is going to be described at this conference, in which one of our speakers, Liz Parrish, is going to be talking about this kind of thing in relation to aging. Liz's main claim to popular fame is that she had gene therapy for telomerase and follistatin a few years ago in order to help her slow down her aging. Now, whether that is scientifically valid is definitely a question. And whether we will even find out anything about whether it's scientifically valid by studying an N of 1 is also a big question. So to me, the main reason why that was so important was because it gave Liz Parrish the opportunity to get on stage and on camera a very great deal and generally say the kinds of things I say, but in different words that resonate with a different audience than what I resonate with. And she has made the most astronomical amount of contribution in that way in the advocacy world over these past few years. But so yes, N of 1, tricky. But the more people do this, and if they do it right, proper baseline information before they do things and so on, and proper monitoring, getting good advice about how to do the monitoring, then it adds up. It's not, it's not a double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial, but it's definitely not nothing either.
And also this whole concept around open source. So the fact that obviously Python, they've got all their, I can't remember the acronym, PIP. So basically you pip install and you install other people's packages. So basically, is there a website that anybody at this conference can go to and you guys list out projects and then say I code in Python, I can type in Python and I say, oh, there's this project on aging, I'm going to help out there. Or you go around to the retirement homes and say some of these elderly have got skills that actually you can use in some of these projects. I'm sure they'll be more than delighted to help out if it.
Well, don't be too sure, but I mean, yeah, all of what you just said is very valid. Some of it's more, well, closer to reality, closer to current reality than others. Certainly at the level of younger people being involved in skills. One of the things that I'll be talking about tomorrow that we funded recently is a retreat. It was called Less Death. There are various people here who were there. It was all about exactly that, bringing basically people who had certain skills, who were excited about longevity, but didn't really have much of a clue about how they could contribute to, first of all, meet a lot of other such people, but also, of course, to be educated. So basically, it was 3 days of a couple of, well, probably 15 people doing exactly what I'm doing right now, standing up in front, informally in front of a bunch of people, having very interactive sessions and helping them, orienting them. Yeah.
Because even with the Internet of Things, right, if you can monitor your well-being and your stats, that can go into those research societies.
Yep, totally, 100%. Moritz.
Yes. Regarding.
Wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just recording.
Thank you. Okay. Regarding the maintenance approach and the car analogy, I think someone else in the room has this question too. But isn't this some kind of weakness of the analogy that we've got consciousness and the car doesn't have any emergent phenomenon like this? Because, of course, there's the concern that replacing, for example, lost neurons with neural stem cells, the first sense strand, at the top, would would affect consciousness. And I of course know about the whole ship of Theseus thing and so on. So replacing it slowly enough. But how do you determine how slowly you have to replace it? Is it the rate at which the body loses neurons, or what is it?
So there's a couple of ways in which people have reservations about the analogy between cars or airplanes or whatever versus living organisms, especially humans. And the most popular one is not the one that you just said. It's mostly like, but humans are so much more complicated, which of course is not much of a complaint because it's just a difference of degree. And then the second complaint is basically, but humans have their own self-repair, which we've talked about quite a bit already today. But of course, that's also not a complaint because the fact that we have self-repair is a good thing. It means that there's less for us to develop. We are augmenting the gaps in what we already naturally have. And if we had bigger gaps, as in no repair, then it would be harder. So those two things are not very important. But the question that Moritz asked is also very important. One, the question of whether the brain will actually do what we want it to do in the context of rejuvenation. And there are a couple of simple answers to this. The first one is, replacing neurons. You've got different neurons, you might have different memory, different personality, whatever, in the end. But it's better than not replacing the neurons. You also go down, you change if your neurons are going away, whether or not you're putting new ones in. The other point is that since memory and such like is stored, if you like, holographically, in a distributed way, it means that a slow rate, even if we do it, even if we purposely do it faster than it would naturally need to be done. In other words, let's say we kill our neurons off 10 times faster than they would naturally die, so that we can replace them with young neurons, right? Even if we did that, it's not at all clear that we would really be losing information, not significant information. But I think actually the most fundamental answer here is that the brain works by absorbing new information. So, as well, and of course forgetting stuff as well. You know, probably if you're my age or even if you're Barry's age, you're forgetting stuff just as fast as you're learning new stuff, and that's okay. And the reason it's okay is because recalling a memory reinforces it automatically. Hence, the things you forget are the things that not only did you learn them a long time ago, but you didn't care. You know, I can't remember half the names of the people I went to college with, but that doesn't, I don't wake up, I don't stress about it. Right. So that's my main answer.
Thank you.
It must be in there somewhere, because my mother died of Alzheimer's, and the worse she got, the more the memories were from the past, things that I didn't even know she started seeing nursery rhymes in French.
So yeah, let me actually say a couple of things about Alzheimer's, because this is obviously, you know, we have an epidemic of it. You know, everybody's terrified of getting it, everybody's terrified of their parents getting it. The question is, how late in the progression of Alzheimer's are we likely to have a respectable chance of actually intervening productively, right? And a widespread belief, which I share, is that actually we can probably intervene productively a lot later than you might think superficially, because the hippocampus is an area of the brain that's particularly severely impacted by neurodegeneration in Alzheimer's. And the reason that matters is because the hippocampus doesn't actually store long-term memories. Its function is to be a kind of pipeline between the long-term and the short-term, right, in both directions. And thus, if you kind of just could rejuvenate the hippocampus, you might kind of unlock a lot of stuff that's locked in, right, that is, as you say, the long-term memories that become increasingly inaccessible. Didier?
Yeah, it's more a remark than a question, but concerning all clinical trials that we could start if we had enough data, it's not that we don't have enough data, enough health data at the moment. We have more than enough health data. The problem is that we are not able to share this data and to curate this data because of intellectual property laws, because of patents, because of all these regulations concerning privacy. But really, we have more than enough data to start today clinical trials. I don't know, with metformin, with the TRIM study, and so on.
You're completely correct. And I should tell everybody, Didier here, stand up for a second so everyone can see you. Stand up for a second. Right. Yeah, Didier will be giving a talk. Is it tomorrow or the next day? I forget which.
Next day.
Okay, on exactly this topic.
Yeah.
So there's a lot you should listen.
But please don't say we don't have enough data. In most cases, we have enough data, but we cannot share it. We are not able to share it for many reasons.
Time to wrap up, you think? It's 3:35. Okay, so yes, I mean, I actually don't remember specifically what time we're supposed to be starting the short talks. All right, so, well, you heard the woman. So yes, so I am very happy to have spent all this time. I will answer one more question.
I just totally disagree. We don't have enough data. For example, I'm just doing the analysis.
All right. Tell us when you'll have much more time to argue with Didier after his talk, or for that matter, during the poster session tonight. So good. Thank you very much, everybody.